Introduce a couple of friends to you. This is Jabra Shack. He's an author. He's written over 170 books, of which I'm sure you've read some of them along your travels to high school. And he's also an outdoorsman. He has at their place, they have an outdoor activity place, and they do a lot of things outside. And over here we have Jesse Bruchac, Joe's son, who is also an author and a musician, and he's going to introduce you to some instruments. And he's also a fluent speaker, so he'll give you an introduction to the Abenaki language. And we have a few books when you leave, if we can walk out this way. We have a book for each class you can take back to your class. So thank you for coming and enjoy the program.
Kwai kwai, nidobak. Hello, my friends. Kwai kwai is the Abenaki word for hello. My son Jesse and I are members of the Nulhegan Band of the Abenaki Nation. My name is Joseph, we're the peaceful one. I am of an area called Saratoga, or the Medicine Spring Place, in New York State, the Adirondack Mountain region. A human being is what I am. My son Jesse will come up and introduce himself, and today we're going to share with you some stories, some music, and also give you a chance to ask some questions, to give you a little bit of introduction into the culture of the Alnobak, the human beings, the Abenaki people, the original and contemporary inhabitants of what we call today Vermont, what we call Ndakina, our land.
Kwai kwai. I got a couple of brave ones. Kwai kwai. Yeah, it's an old way to say hello. In the language, we'd say kwai. Another thing that would be said when you hadn't seen somebody for a little while is a little harder to say. Pa'aku nonguzian. Pa'aku nonguzian means you appear new to me. And it refers to the idea if you haven't seen someone for a while, they've probably grown and changed. So it's a polite way to greet someone and recognizing the ways in which they've changed. And the Abenaki have been here for a long time, and in many ways we've also changed. And we want to share just a little bit of the old ways that survive to this day and bring you up to date on some of the more contemporary things that are happening, including, as we mentioned, some of my father's writing, some of my own writing. I work with the Abenaki language. It was, when I was your age, when I just got out of high school, there were still close to 100 speakers of the language, which isn't a lot, considering everyone used to speak Abenaki here in Vermont. To have only 100, I realized it was important, as did others, so I really dove into the language. Every one of those speakers that I knew when I was around your age has since passed away. Luckily, I've raised 2 children. I have a daughter in high school and a son who just went to middle school who are fluent in the language, and we're hopefully bringing another generation forward to revitalize and preserve the language, which I'll share a little bit of with you today and what little time we have together. But again, as I said, we'll say hello in a few ways, kwai kwai, pa'aku nonguzian, and via song. The oldest way to greet one another long ago would be to sing a greeting song, a song of greeting followed by a song of welcoming. The greeting song would be sung along the rivers where the villages were located of the Abenaki people. Here, the Quanitakuk, or the Long River, now pronounced Connecticut. It's an Abenaki word. Abenaki people lived along that river and would travel back and forth as we've traveled here to visit you from our home, but not on highways, instead on those rivers, and not in cars, but instead in wigwaulau, within canoes, which are the old mode of transportation. If we weren't walking, we were traveling by canoe. And this is a song that would be sung, would one, keep us in time as we paddled the canoe. The rhythm would keep us in time as we paddled, but also the song was sung to let people know around perhaps the next Kwazon-Wawon-Desek, the next oxbow of the river, there'd be a village and they would hear us coming. We would announce our coming with this song and wait for a return, a welcoming song, which would say, you're welcome to come and land your canoes here and visit with us for a while. So you'll hear in this old song both that call from the canoe, the people paddling down the river, and that call from the shore in response. Yo guano de yo guano da yo guano de yo guano da gailani he
guano da. Gaiawani hey, ayo yo hey. Gaiawani hey, ayo yo hey. Gaiawani hey, ayo yo hey. Gaiawani hey, ayo yo hey.
Guano de, guano de, guano de, guano da de. Guano de, guano de, guano de, guano da de. Guano de, guano de, hey, guano de, guano de, hey, guano de, guano da de. Guano de, guano da de. Woo! Noa nongonini pomosu noa closing taonao yo alno baondo nganek. It was long ago that people would speak just like that in the Abenaki language. Kluzo nganao udzi aga kimzo winoak in dawonsi samak. In order to teach the children, words were really important, and for those words to reach you, you have to open up your ears. And so it said that long ago, Katsinowask, the one that is called the Great Mystery, created human beings on this earth, and people were shaped like all of us with 2 ears and 1 mouth, because it is twice as important for us to listen as it is for us to talk. And in the oral traditions of Abenaki people, oral tradition is one where there were no schools, there were no central institutions for teaching and learning like colleges and universities. Instead, people would have to listen very well. And one of the #1 modes of teaching and passing on knowledge that was learned from one generation to the next was through storytelling. Those stories have been passed down from one person to another. Some have been since written down, and they've also inspired a lot of my father's writing and a lot of my writing. And I'd like to share, and I know my father will as well, an example of some of these old stories in the way that they were told. And they were told for 2 reasons. One, they would be told because they'd be entertaining, and winter was the main time for storytelling, and it could get pretty boring living in a wigwam or a longhouse over a long winter without much to do. So stories would help pass the time. But also within those stories, there would be lessons. They would teach us. They would act as a way to pass on knowledge. And so you'll hear in this story that hopefully it's entertaining, and also that it may teach you something if you listen closely. But to make sure you're listening, I'm going to do something my father did and many storytellers before us here in the Northeast have done, and that's to say ho. And when I say ho, I'd like you all to say together in one voice, hey. Ho? Hey. Ho? Hey. Very good. Very good. All right. Noa nongonini, long, long ago, Yodali. Gluskomba Pompomosat Kapiwi. Long ago there was one named Gluskomba, the one who shaped himself. And Gluskomba was walking through the forest. He had great power. He was here to help protect the people, to help take care of them. And he heard the people crying for his help. So Gluskomba went to the Odina, to the village of the people, not too far from here on the Connecticut, the Quanitacook River. And when he came into that village, he saw the people were all suffering. He asked what was wrong. He said, why is it that you're crying? And they said, oh, my friend, our river, it has no water. Our river is totally dry. Ho? Well, this was a terrible thing. Without the river, the people could not grow the corn, squash, and beans in their fields that they needed to survive. They couldn't bathe. They had nothing to drink. Couldn't clean themselves. They couldn't do anything that they needed to do to live. Gluskomba saw how miserable they were and told them that he would help. He jumped down into that riverbed and began to walk up the river. Ho? He walked for a long time, and he came around he came around a corner, and there he saw in front of him a great kabanigan, a great dam. He looked up at that dam, and he saw standing atop of that dam many warriors. Called to them, he said, Mili Nabi, Liulau Damana ni Dombak. Give me some water, my friends. Inkadawes mi pita. I'm very thirsty. Kama agamo ibita ida onda. But all those warriors could say was no. Well, Gluskomba called up again and said, I am the great Gluskomba, I have great power. Take me to your Songomon. Let me speak with your chief. And they said, onda again. Gluskomba got angry, and Gluskomba stomped his foot on the ground. Ho! When he did, he grew taller, and he stomped his foot again a second time. Ho! A third time. Ho! And a fourth time. Ho! And he was taller than that dam. He looked down over that dam. All those warriors saw how great and tall and powerful he was, and they ran. But on the other side, there was one huge monster. This monster, Aglabemu, just stood up. It was terrible. He'd never seen anything like it, with huge bulging eyes and long fingers, a huge fat body, and it reached out and grabbed Gluskomba. The two began to wrestle. Ho! But luckily, as I mentioned, Gluskomba had great power and was able to defeat that creature. He grabbed it and squeezed it and broke its back. As he squeezed it, water shot out of its eyes, got smaller and smaller. He kept squeezing it and squeezing it and squeezing it until that creature, that Aglabemu, was squished down into the size of a little bullfrog. It had become the first bullfrog, and Gluskomba just told it to go live in the swamps where it lives to this day, saying, Aglabem, give them none. Aglabem, give them none. Give them none of the water, because it had wanted all the water to itself. Not a good thing at all. Gluskomba took a great big pine tree and smashed that dam. And the water started to run back down the Kunitakuk again. Ho! It ran right by those people's village, and they were so excited to have that water, they missed that they dove in, and some of the people were changed forever into the very first Nsquamag, the very first salmon who swim in the river to this day. And that is the end of that story of Gluskomba. Thank you.
One thing about our stories is that they're always told for at least two reasons. One, to entertain, but two, because they contain useful lessons. This particular story I'm going to share with you is one that's told both among the Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois people, and the Alnobak, the Abenaki or Abenaki people. It is a story that comes from long ago. In fact, this story comes from a very time ago, they say. Ho!
Hey!
Three people were traveling late at night through the forest. A woman with her baby and her husband. And as she carried the baby, the husband was complaining. "My wife," he said, "why do we have to go to the village of your relatives just to get a name for our son? We can do it some other time. I'm tired." And she looked at him, she said, "My husband, it is time to do this. You should not complain so much. I'm carrying our son, I'm carrying our packs. All you have to do is walk." "Yes, but it's a long way to walk and my feet are hurting." So he continued complaining as they walked through the darkness. Now they had started out early enough to reach the village of her family where she would gain that name for their child from her parents, which was the old traditional way. But her husband had held back and complained so much that night had fallen and it was dark. And now they were passing on a trail through a deep forest where no one ever went at night. Word is said, strange things happened there. But the light of the full moon was shining down on them so they could see their path. Ho!
Hey!
They came to a rise in the trail and looked down, and there below them they could see, beside the trail, a small wigwam, a little longhouse. Now the wife had been on this trail before, had never seen that little longhouse. She thought it was strange, but the husband saw it and said, "Oh, my wife, look, there's a place. Let's spend the rest of the night there." And he stepped in front of her and ran down the hill to that little longhouse. As she was starting to say, "My husband, I don't think it's a good idea." But he had already reached the door of that longhouse, looked inside, looked back at her and said, "This is perfect. There's a bed where I can sleep. You can sleep here on the floor." And by the time she arrived at that door, he was on that sleeping rack, made of bent sticks tied together, and he pulled over him a bearskin rug that had been left there. Well, the woman looked around, holding her baby, the packs on her back. She did not want to stay there. She felt something was wrong about this place. She looked around and she could see in the rafters, it looked like there was a bundle of birch bark, a big, long bundle of birch bark, like something might be wrapped in to store it. My husband, she said, I think we should continue on. His answer to her was, he was sound asleep. So she took off the pack. She took her blanket, placed it on the floor to make a place for the baby to sleep, and then she lay down. Now the light of the moon was shining in through the door of that little longhouse. But as she lay there, her eyes open, her ears open, listening, for she was uncertain about this place, a cloud began to move across the face of the moon, and all became dark inside that longhouse. And in that darkness, she began to hear a kind of a scratching sound, like something moving overhead and then moving down the wall. And in that darkness, she thought she could see a moving shadow, but she just lay there, uncertain what to do. And then that cloud cleared the face of the moon and the light shone back in, and again she thought she saw something moving going up the wall, but she was not sure. She thought to herself, this is not a good place. I'm going to wake my husband and tell him that we must go, and if he will not go with me, I will take our child and I will leave her alone. So she crawled over to her husband. My husband, she said, wake up. He did not move. She shook his shoulder. Wake up! He still did not move. She reached one hand up to touch his face, and it was moist. And she looked closer, and the moonlight showed her that what she saw was blood. His face was covered with blood. His throat had been ripped out. He was dead. She turned around to look, and in that moonlight she could see blood stains going up the wall toward that bundle in the rafters, and sticking out from the side of that bundle was one skeletal hand with blood on it. She knew now where they were. You see, in the old days, when someone died, and when their spirits were strong in the bad way, it was customary to wrap them in birch bark, to build a small longhouse far from the village, and to place them in the rafters. And no one would disturb that burial place. But they had stepped into the longhouse of a cannibal skeleton. She knew as soon as it grew dark again, it would emerge from that birch bark bundle and come for her and her baby. But this woman was quick thinking and brave. She spoke in a voice that could be heard. She said, "Oh, my husband, you are asleep. I will not bother you." And she lay back down. She pulled her baby close to her and wrapped the blanket around them so the baby was held tight to her body. And then, moving no more than a finger width at a time, she began to move toward that open doorway and reached it just as a cloud came back over the face of the moon. She leaped up and began to run in the darkness along the trail she knew, and as she ran, she heard from behind the cry of that cannibal skeleton that had discovered she was gone. She ran faster now. And as she ran, she could hear behind her the boop, 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 boop of bony feet. She turned back over her shoulder to look, and it was right there, reaching for her, grabbing at her hair. She ran even faster now. And she could see ahead of her as she ran a light of a fire. They were not far from the village of her parents. She ran toward that light of the fire, ran, and as she tripped and fell next to the fire, calling out for help, suddenly a hand grabbed her shoulder. She turned to look. It was her own mother. "My daughter, how did you come here? Why did you cry for help?" That woman sat up holding her baby, looked back towards the edge of the trail, and there, standing at the edge of the trail, not wanting to come close to that fire, stood that cannibal skeleton. It raised up one long, bony arm, pointed at them, screamed one last time, turned, vanished back into the darkness. By now her grandmother had come out. Her grandmother said, "Oh, my daughter, I see that one. I know who it is. I know what we must do." The next day, a party of men and women, led by the grandmother, followed that daughter to the place where that wigwam, that longhouse had been. It was gone. There was no sign of it. All there was a pile of broken and decayed and dead sticks and bark, as if something had been there long ago but had fallen apart. But the grandmother was not fooled. She said, "Make a circle of dry wood around that." They did that. Then she said, "Make the fire." And they lit the fire on all sides, and it began to burn, and smoke began to rise out that fire, and then suddenly, poof, out of it ran a white rabbit that ran between their legs and disappeared into the forest. It was the spirit of that husband. And within that smoke, which was still rising, they could see a shape moving around, a shape that was dark, frightening. The grandmother said, "Be ready, hold your weapons ready, for they have bows and arrows and clubs." When out of that smoke came flying a great horned owl that swooped over their heads and vanished into the forest. The spirit of that cannibal skeleton. And as they stood there, sparks began to rise from that fire and then began to fall all around them, burning them, and they realized it was not sparks, it was little creatures biting them. It was the first mosquitoes, the children of that cannibal skeleton, that still eat us to this day. So it is to this day, sometimes, when a man and a woman are walking late at night by a forest, they hear the sound of the great horned owl. That woman may turn to her husband and say, "My husband, remember what happened to that man who did not listen to his wife?" That is the story of the cannibal skeleton.
We have some other instruments to share with you as well as the stories, and you got to hear the Pakoligan. I'll say something about the Abenaki language. It's not just a collection of new words that we can learn. It's a whole other way of seeing the world when we learn another language. And you may get to study another language. I hope you do in your school. But probably not one as different as Abenaki is to English, but not different at all to this place. It comes from this place. In fact, when we learn words in Abenaki, we learn more about our home here in Vermont. The ash tree, there are two types of ash, black ash and white ash. The black ash is called the Bazanodakwam in Abenaki, which means the basket-making tree. So by learning that name, we learn what tree to find to make baskets. It exists in the swamps along with those aglabim, along with those bullfrogs. The white ash is called Ongamakwam. It is the snowshoe-making tree. It grows much higher up in the mountains. And we know what tree to use to make our snowshoes. It would be molondax, or a red cedar. That's what this wood is that's used to make flutes. And I'd like to tell you a little bit of a story about the coming of the flute and its use, and use a little bit more of the language. But before I do, I want to see how good you guys are at listening. I'm going to tell you a story entirely in Abenaki, just as a test as to how the language used to be used long ago. I will say that there are a lot of animals that no one had seen in Europe, and so they asked Abenaki people, the English, when they first came, they said, "I want to know, who is that? What is that animal?" people would give them a name, like moose, for example. Moose is an Abenaki word. When you say moose, you're speaking Abenaki. Caribou, Makoni Bu, the shoveler, is an Abenaki word. There are lots of these words that were loaned into the language, but interestingly enough, the language speaks not only of animals as who is that, but even when people would look up at a mountain, in the language you would never say, what mountain is that? You would say, who is that mountain? Awani na, who is that mountain? Of the drum, that instrument, I'd say, Awani na, who is that drum? In fact, half the world is divided up into being considered animate and inanimate. Within Algonquian languages, Abenaki is an Eastern Algonquian language, and within it, we see half the world as having spirit and being alive. And this story that I'll tell briefly is going to require you to listen pretty closely, and it talks about an animal that people had never seen in Europe. Another one, and you'll hear that name, and so its name was borrowed into English, and we all speak it. It says, Noa Nongoniwi, one we call the trickster, Asban, raccoon, was walking around. Asban pompomosat kapiwi ta'agama u nami hon skunk. Ta'agama ida kwai kwai ni domba. Ta skunk ida o kwai kwai ni domba. Awani kia. Asban na dodamawa na skunk. Ho? Kanwa skunk ida o akwi na dodamawini. Nia in Wiswongan madzi gen ni domba. Oh, liu lao damana. Tani kia ki wazanem Wiswongan skunk. Kanwa skunk ida nisda onda na dodamawi ni domba. Liu lao damana. Kanwa Asban na dodamawa na skunk. Insida liu lao damana. Kagwi kia skunk. Kagwi kia Wiswongan skunk. Skunk iauda ida onda na dodamawi ni. Anagita ni. Skunk ida tsoi kama wawonzumowi ni domba. Ta skunk quilbosa. Ta tsigoniwi. Ta don't kanamenu sogana. Ta asban kinamen. Ta skunk ida olonzi. Asban ida olonzi. Ta skunk taunawio. Ta asban ida, oh, madzi mongwa, pita ta agama matsina. Nialitz. And that is the end of that story. Oh? Does anybody know who that raccoon ran into? Pretty easy. And he asked him, why are you called Skunk? Skunk said, not a good thing to ask. You don't want to know. But that raccoon kept asking and asking the way raccoon does to this day. The trickster, always trying to get into things, doesn't know how to take no for an answer, and asked 4 times. And Skunk decided to show him. He said, I warned you, which is kind of cool. To warn someone has become the name in the Abenaki language for a phone. The telephone is now called Wawonzamawik. We didn't have phones long ago, so had to use a word. It is the warner, or the one that informs us of things. And he had informed Asban of the danger, but Asban didn't listen, so he bent over and showed him exactly why he's called Skunk. And skunk in Abenaki means the sprayer. Skunk is the meaning of that word. Oh? So another instrument and one more story. Hold on to questions. We'll have a little time for some questions. Noa Nongoniwi, long ago, Gluskomba was living in his wigwam, and he had a nephew who lived with him and often traveled around. Probably when he went and fought that terrible water monster, Moosebas was there, but we never hear about Moosebas. Moosebas is the unsung hero. Moosebas means the mink, the one who emerges, the mink. That he emerges by his side, he walks by him, but we never hear about him in the stories. We hear all these stories about his great uncle, Gluskomba, and so Moosebas started to get sad because he was always traveling around. He was the cook for Moosebas, or for Gluskomba. Moosebas would make all the meals, take care of all the things, and get none of the credit. And he'd seen as he traveled on all these adventures, all his friends had done something he never did. They'd gotten married, and they'd started families of their own, and Moosebas thought he may live alone forever. So he went to the wigwam of his uncle. He said, Gluskomba, could you please help me? I don't have a wife. I don't know how to find one, and I've helped you for so long. And Gluskomba said, uh-huh. An Abenaki word you all know, uh-huh. Anybody know what that means?
Uh-huh.
Yes, you do, indeed. Uh-huh. Yes, uh-huh. So he reached behind him, Gluskomba, and pulled out a flute. He said, this is a magic flute that I've made for you, my nephew. Blow into the end of it and it will call the heart of one of the female creatures to you. She will be your wife, give you a family. The word for heart in Abenaki is ulawongan. La means truth. Ulawongan is one's truth, one's essence. Their truth is in their heart. It will call that heart to you. Oh, Kitsi Ulione, Muspas said. He took that flute and he went off into the woods to see if it really did have that magic to call him a wife. As he played, he noticed a loon, Madawi Hlas, flying towards him. It circled around him 4 times and then landed beside him. Its heart was his, that loon woman. Oh, Moose Hlas was excited. That loon came and started rubbing against his legs, and he noticed as it moved, it kind of waddled side to side. He thought, it's great my flute works, but I can't marry a loon. Can't marry this looks like a duck. Oh. And he picked up that flute. He said, now that I know that it works, I'll play another song. And he blew in it, but when he did, he broke the heart of that loon woman who he called with that first song. And with that broken heart, she flew not too far from here to the north onto a pond where you may still hear her singing that song that he played on the flute for her long ago. And he just played again. Waited to see if it would work again, and sure enough, this time not flying, but running, ligadahit, out of the forest, bounding, was Nulka Squaw, dear woman. He thought, oh, I've called dear woman. She'll be a great wife. She came running towards him. But that song he was playing was still ringing in his ears. He thought, I've only played this flute twice, and I've gotten pretty good at it already. Pretty gifted musician. I could probably play a better song than that. Looking away from that dear woman, he put the flute to his lips again and blew, and she just turned around and ligadahit, kapiwi, ran back into the forest. Never looking back at Muspas as he played yet another song. When he finished playing, there was no one flying or running towards him at all. Oh, yeah. He waited. The sun was starting to set in the west as it does, and then he noticed there was someone coming out of the forest, lumbering slowly towards him. It was Awasosqua. It was Bear Woman. Oh, he thought, I called Bear Woman. She can keep me warm in our long, cold winters. She's a great cook. I won't have to cook for anyone again. She knows all the medicines. I will have a great wife. And Bear Woman, sure enough, was coming towards him. Her heart was his. He was excited, but he was even more excited that he was able to call her. He thought, I've called Bear Woman. Imagine who I could call if I played one more song. Oh! Yeah. He put that flute to his lips again to blow, but when he did, he upset Bear Woman. It's not a good idea to upset a Bear Woman, especially not to break her heart. She saw him about to play another song and reached out with one of her paws and Zulig Zagana Agama Uskiziwi Pikwonganek. She just smushed him right down onto that flute, smashing his flute into pieces beneath him and breaking his back. His crooked, broken back is that way to this day, and no longer is he a mink. Muspas had been smooshed down when she lifted up her paw to the very first saguasis, become the very first weasel. And Weasel ran off into the forest of that crooked, broken back where he lives alone to this day. Hope? They say that that flute that had that magic, the magic remains in the trees. And so it is that a flute is often called a courting flute, and it is a native tradition for a young man to write a song for a young woman as a proposal of marriage. Rather than getting an engagement ring, songs would be played. And if that song was accepted, it would belong to the woman. She would put words to it and sing it as a lullaby to any children they might have together. I'd like to share just one lullaby. And as I do, you can think if you have any questions for us. This one is called the Penobscot Lullaby, and I'll do it using a third instrument. There are three main instruments: Pakoligan, the drum, Pikwongan, the flute, and Sisiwan, the rattle, that were used traditionally by the Abenaki people here in Vermont, and still to this day used. In fact, the rattle is one of those instruments that helped carry the songs forward. People often ask, how did the language and the songs and the stories survive? To a degree, people got quiet, or quieter. The drum was loud. The often Catholic priests who set up native communities or communities where Abenakis lived, if people heard drumming, they knew it was Indian music. It was sometimes banned, dangerous to play. So people started using rattles. Even in the 90s, when I was young and I'd go up to the reserve in Canada called Odenak and other places, there were no drums. Everybody was still singing the songs though with rattles. So these rattles, a little more quiet, people you can dance to them, you can sing to them, and they've kept songs like this one alive. This one sung by our cousins, the closest dialect to Abenaki. In fact, we are speaking the same language. It's called Penobscot, and our cousins, the Penobscot, live in Maine. This song is called the Penobscot Lullaby. As I sing it, we can hear and imagine a young man playing it long ago on the flute as a proposal, a successful proposal of marriage, because words were put to it and it became a lullaby that would have been sung long ago by a Penobscot woman for their children. And the words say, "Sleep well, little baby." Paloni snoot kwasen, hea 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 no. Paloni snoot kwasen, hea 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 no. Hea he, hea no. Hea 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 he, hea 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 no. Paloni snoot kwasen, hea 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 no. Paloni snoot kwasen, hea 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 no. Hea he, hea no. Hea 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 he, hea hea hea. Hope? Thank you.
Okay, folks, wake up. Would anybody like to ask a question? If so, could you raise your hand and speak clearly so that we can hear you? Yes.
Are there any problems that you people face?
Are there any problems that Abenaki people face? Yeah, indigenous people in general have faced problems from the moment that contact began. And I mean, just to do a very quick overview of some of the problems. You may be familiar with Squanto, the story of the Pilgrims coming. Before even the Pilgrims came in 1620, his people had almost been entirely wiped out by disease. So one of the major problems that indigenous people faced right off were diseases that we had no ability to fight. So huge percentages of Abenaki populations were equally affected, and people were lost to disease, and communities were really disrupted. Those communities that did survive ended up making not the best choices as far as our allies in the long term. We ended up allying often with the French, and we know that the French did not do so well and ended up getting driven out of New England, in Dakinau, our homeland. So the Abenaki lived often in hiding because they were not welcome. In fact, for a long period of time, there were bounties and scalps were taken by colonists of Abenakis living still within New England, because they were seen as a threat. More recently, Abenaki have continued to endure different types of prejudice against them and racism. And I think most recently, and we can learn about it in some of my father's writing, especially a book called Hidden Roots, there's been a project called the Eugenics Project, which targeted Native American people and people who were considered or deemed not, how would you say, not of the right stock to continue and have children. So they were actually sterilizing women systematically to quote unquote breed better Vermonters right here in Vermont. Certainly caused Abenaki people to not want to be visibly seen as Abenaki or different. And when we look at, I mentioned our cousins in Maine, up until the 90s, the Abenaki in Maine were targeted and their children were actually being taken away from them as the parents were seen as unfit to raise them. So there were—
Because they were poor, basically.
Because, yeah, so there have been a whole history of problems. Through all that, there has been, the culture has withstood all of this, and families have quietly held on to and preserved the language, songs, and stories, which now, luckily, we have opportunities to stand up and share with people. And I heard my father say earlier, and I think one of the most powerful things that indigenous people of this land, our ancestors knew, was the importance of protecting and taking care of this land and respecting it. That it is something very sacred and very important, and that we should always be acting and keeping in mind not just our people, but human beings in general for 7 generations to come, and how our actions may affect them.
Just here in the state of Vermont, for example, there's a long tradition of Abenaki people serving as game wardens and game protectors. There's also a long tradition of Abenaki people maintaining culture but hiding in plain sight. Talking about being French Canadian was perhaps okay, although there was a lot of prejudice there too, but not talking about being Native American. So it's only within the last decade that we have obtained state tribal recognition from Vermont State, although for more than 3 decades we were fighting for that recognition just to be able to say we are Native people and therefore we have a culture and traditions that are ours. There is, for example, in the United States, a law that says you cannot sell your goods as Native American unless you are belonging to a federally or state recognized tribe. You could be fined $10,000 if you were trying to sell something. This is an Abenaki basket that I made, I'm Abenaki. And before we had recognition, it was illegal to do that. So there's a lot of other little things that have to do with this, but basically, here in Vermont, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, they said there were no Native people. They were all gone and they'd never been here. And yet, if you go up to Swanton, Vermont, they used ground radar without digging things up and discovered this one graveyard in Vermont, in Swanton, is the largest Native American graveyard in the world. There are thousands and thousands of people buried there, and a place where a Bruchac family was digging a house foundation. They excavated things which were later finally returned, bones and other artifacts. They found copper from the Great Lakes that was 3,000 years old, copper ornaments. So there have been thousands of years of trade and surviving and thriving in this country, in this land, Vermont, and Dakina, our land as we call it. And today, many of us, like myself and my son, are people of mixed ancestry. We have Abenaki and other European ancestry, but we still know who we are. We are family, we are community, and we belong to the Nulhegan Abenaki tribe here in Vermont. And Abenaki people are found all over the Northeast, including the area of New York State where we live, where there were many Abenaki people. My grandfather used to go back and forth to Vermont to visit relatives. And often we had to literally, as I said before, hide in plain sight, keep a low profile, so that things would not happen to us or to our children. But now we're standing up, speaking for ourselves, and also speaking for the land and for the future, for all of us to survive together. Other questions?
What do you mean?
Thank you for that question. I appreciate it.
Yeah, right back there.
Do you have like a favorite traditional food?
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, favorite traditional food. I love corn soup in sombone, we call it, in sombone. The cool thing about corn soup is ashes are actually added to it from your fire to prepare it. And another cool thing about it is that corn, along with many other things, were engineered by the botanists of this continent, of North and South America. Really Central America is where it began, but corn ended up being a gift to the whole world that indigenous people of the Americas created over generations. We have a ceremony that I've been able to take part in called the Green Corn Festival. And at that festival, after everyone harvests the corn, the mothers are the ones, the grandmothers really are the ones who are brought out and look at the corn and decide which of it will go to seed for the next year and which of it will then be eaten. And it's a very, very important tradition because when you're choosing the seeds, you're then changing slowly over time. You're basically domesticating those crops and changing them into what were grasses, into all these corns, which are now gifts to the whole world. And corn soup is just one of many, many things we can get from corn. It's used in all kinds of things. It's one of what we'd call the three sisters, as you may have heard, the corn, squash, and beans, all from indigenous people.
By the way, when you cook corn with the hardwood ash, it produces a chemical reaction, which makes the corn more nutritious. And if you cook corn without doing that, it lacks nutrition. In fact, Europeans began using corn not knowing about the wood ash method, and they began to suffer from various vitamin deficiencies because the vitamin B, the other vitamins are not released if you don't do that particular way of cooking corn. And how Native people discovered that, I don't know, but it shows how much traditional knowledge is based on real necessity and science. Other questions?
How was Abenaki traditions affected by European and American cultures?
How are Abenaki traditions affected by other cultures?
Yeah.
I think today there's obviously a great deal of pressure because my own kids, we have all our devices and we have all these other influences coming in. So there is a lot of influence. However, I feel like we've come to a turning point where people are using that to help inspire a new generation, using what is contemporary and what is traditional and creating something new. But that has been a struggle, and that is an ongoing struggle. My father's generation was not one who many people were very proud of their ancestry, and he was able to stand up and try and find and carve out something that I saw and recognized and was lucky enough to grow up and take pride in. And I think that's wonderful, and I'm really thankful for his generation for doing that, keeping in mind that several generations even before his, for reasons that we mentioned earlier, had to really go into almost a disappearance, a time when they were very, very quiet about it. And we're really lucky today to be able to not only combat it, but become part of it and maybe offer something to it. I think we see lots of ways we can all work together and create harmony, really.
I would say, too, taking that in a slightly different direction. When I was a kid, we didn't even have television. And now we have all these digital devices, but Jesse has used it to create westernabenaki.com, a site to teach the Abenaki language using modern technology. And if you go further back and further back still, you'll find here we are wearing cloth. Before we wore animal skins, but the cloth is cut in traditional patterns and has the same symbolic meaning as the traditional clothing did. Or my grandfather did not play the drum, but he played the fiddle. And fiddle tunes were very important to Native people all around the continent. And there's a whole tradition of Native fiddling in many different communities, and it was not unusual for Abenaki people to use the fiddle, and they did it in an interesting way. I was told that up at Odanak, the community once called St. Francis in Canada, the church forbade dancing, traditional Native dancing. So when people gathered together to dance, they would use their rattles, but they'd also keep a fiddle on hand. If they heard that someone was coming, they'd break out the fiddle, and by the time the people from the church came, they were all square dancing. In fact, one of the Abenaki songs, they still sing it at Odanak, goes like this. Way hey hey hey, way hey hey, way hey hey hey, way hey hey, way hey 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 hey, way hey 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 hey. And if you know anything about fiddle music, it's turkey in the haystack, turkey in the hay, turkey in the straw, turkey in the straw. It's a traditional fiddle tune that's been adapted in that way to preserve culture in the face of repression. And I think that's a really interesting comment also we can make, that we can survive by adapting, but not by losing. By bringing things in, but not throwing things out that are most important.
Yeah. Well said.
Why do you both write?
Why do we write? I began reading at an early age and became fascinated with the way you could express how you feel to others and they would understand what you were saying. I mean, I began writing poetry when I was in second grade. I became pretty well known and successful as a poet. I won national awards, a National Endowment for the Arts grant for poetry. But I wanted my kids to hear traditional stories, so I started telling them to them. Then friends of mine said, would you write these down because other people would appreciate them? And that's where that began. And so I write because I want to share the things I care about. And sometimes I want to tell a different side of a story, a side that is more balanced and not just slanted towards a European point of view, which a lot of stuff written about Native people was. It was written in a way that made Native people look either like foolish or savage or vanishing or stupid or pagan. All these different words were used, which were truly racist terms. And the ironic thing is that terms like that at one time or another have been used to describe almost every immigrant group in this country. The Irish were described as being subhuman, for example. And now, Hispanics are being demonized, or people of Arab ancestry are being demonized. And those of us who are American Indians say, well, your turn. We're used to that. But we're all of us, are human beings first and foremost. And that's really important to recognize.
Controversies have subsided recently, but years ago, we would remember, there was a lot of controversy over the Abenaki struggle for hunting privileges beyond what a normal Vermonter would do to get a license. Fishing, driving for a while without a bona fide license plate registered by White Vermont. What's happened with all of that? It seems to have gone away.
I would mention a couple of things. First of all, there's something called Aboriginal traditional right, that when we, as Native people, lived here, we used the land, we hunted, we fished, and we did so in a sustainable way. We didn't wipe it all out. But these laws came in, which are game laws and fishing laws, and often they restricted traditional practices that Native people had to survive. They didn't do it just for fun. And then when the Missisquoi Wildlife Refuge was created in northern Vermont, it kept Abenaki people out of land that was traditionally Abenaki land. In fact, there are very sacred areas, I won't talk specifically, within that marsh. And that was one reason why Abenaki people really began to stand up and become very vocal in their desire to have those rights guaranteed for them that they never gave away, but that were taken from them. My two sons were involved in the fish-ins in northern Vermont, fishing without a license deliberately to get a ticket to then take it to court. I was involved in the fish-in trials. I testified for the Abenaki Nation using traditional stories to demonstrate our long, long relationship to this land, that we've been here for thousands of years, and that we actually are who we say we are, not, as the state said, a group of people pretending to be Indian to get rights that other people didn't have. I think that with the recognition of our tribal nations by the state, that issue has been largely solved. And having tribal recognition by the state means that we are recognized as people who are indigenous to the land, with cultures and traditions that are somewhat different from the rest of Vermont, and that the rest of Vermont can learn from us. In fact, a few weeks ago, Jesse and I were invited to the State House to open the State Senate with a traditional prayer in Abenaki. And a few weeks before that, we were invited to the University of Vermont with other Abenaki people to listen to an apology from the University of Vermont and the state for the Eugenics Project. And a few weeks before that, we were at the Vermont State House again because they were proposing that instead of Columbus Day, we would celebrate Indigenous Peoples Day, which is now happening. So all of this we've just seen within the last year. And it's very positive, and it's not taking anything away from anyone else, but it is recognizing something that should have been recognized long ago. So I'm very positive about it. Jess, did you have something? I agree. Other questions? Yes.
One more.
What are your instruments made out of?
What are the shirts made out of?
Instruments.
Oh, our instruments, yeah.
Take that first.
It can be a quick review. This is Magolni Boo. Does anybody remember what Magolni Boo is? It is an English word now, caribou. It's made out of the skin or raw hide of a caribou, an Abenaki word which means the shoveler, Magolni Boo. And it is Ongamaquam. Inside is a type of tree. It's not a black ash, but a white ash, a snowshoe tree. In this case, being used to make the frame. So these are called frame drums, and the rawhide is stretched over them.
Did you make that about 3 years ago, Jess?
I made this about 20 years ago. We did it. It was
That's right.
that
That's a good
long.
one.
Yeah, and we did this in a weekend. We do all types of gatherings trying to keep the language together, where we did a whole gathering of Abenaki people, and we all made hand drums together and spoke the language around making drums and drumming.
And this rattle is one that I made 40 years ago, and it's actually made out of a piece of cow horn. We would also make them out of buffalo horn, which were here before the cows were. We also would make rattles out of birch bark, elm bark, gourds, bladders, and various things. Basically, something solid enough to put rocks inside it and shake it and produce the sound.
And most, as I mentioned, most of the flutes will be made out of red cedar, but other woods could also be used.
Show them the double flute.
I think we're out of time. Are we to 3:15? Is that right?
Bell will ring at 3:30.
Yeah. This is a flute that Jesse made for me a few years ago, and he actually could make a flute in about a day, starting in the morning with a tree branch and continuing on through the day to make it.
Is there one more question?
Joe, will you play the
Double?
double
Yeah.
so we can see it just a second?
Speaking of harmony, it sounds like we do have a little time to share one more flute with you.
I'll let you do it this time. My flute, he plays it better.
So this one, I mentioned harmony, the idea of working together, and this one gives us one droning chamber in the flute, and then one where we can change the notes. This is called the double flute.
I just wanted to say one more thing. We have an outdoor education center called the Untitled Center in Greenfield Center, New York, in Saratoga Springs. And our motto is that we need to have a healthy mind, a healthy body, and a healthy spirit. We actually have our own martial arts program. Jesse and my son Jim and I are all black belts in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and other forms of martial arts. So continue to think of yourself, whether female or male, as a person who deserves to be in health physically and mentally and spiritually. And that balance is important, especially for you young people who are about to move out into the world and take our places. That is why I wish you good journeys and strength. And I say, Uliuni ni toba. Thank you, my friends. Closing song.
This is our last. I want to say thank you to Gedaki Na for making the last few days
Judy
possible.
Dow for her wonderful
Judy
work.
Dow for bringing us in. We do have books for you on your way out for each class. It's been a real pleasure to be here. You guys have been a great audience. This is a song of thanks, and we have a lot to be thankful for today. So Kitsi Uliuni, thank you. He go, he gane. Quando
guano dia, guano de. Guana dia, guano da, hey ya, hey yo, de yoga, de yoga.